When might psychiatric drugs be helpful? A philosophical interpretation of this question can be attempted. As an analogy that can perhaps be helpful, we can consider something like a test, a math test, let's say. We can ask ourselves, to what extent does the student's performance on this math test hinge on his or her physiological feelings? And to what extent does it hinge on the knowledge that he or she has? We say that at most, the physiological state can be necessary and or helpful, or should we say helpful and or necessary, but not sufficient in order to do well on the math test. Meaning, for there to be the possibility of doing well on the test, I do have to be, as the student, awake. Right? I have to be in a sufficiently kind of, say, alert state. If I'm totally falling asleep, right, I'm super drowsy, it's going to be a big disadvantage to say the least. Further, there's different kinds of things certainly that can be going on mentally, such as can be adjusted by, for example, sleep, diet, caffeine intake, other intakes of different things. But all of that, at most, is necessary, and other things are helpful. So, for example, coffee can be helpful, but not necessary. Even if I have the physiological, conditions absolutely perfect, that still will not in the slightest enable me to so much as pass the math test unless I know the math, unless I flip the coin right and happen to get all the answers right, which probably won't happen. So that can be a useful analogy concerning the question of if and when psychiatric drugs, meaning drugs that are intended to modulate our mind, our emotions, even some would say our conscious states themselves, when they can be useful. In order to, let's say, first of all, take the objective of being happy, mature, well adjusted, being able to lead a somewhat, at least, satisfying life. In order for there to be any shot at that objective being fulfilled, there are, needless to say, very many helpful and or necessary conditions. For example, if I am under general anesthesia, I won't be leading a fulfilling, exciting, happy life because I'm under anesthesia, general anesthesia. If I'm sleeping, it's the same thing. If I'm so sleep deprived that I'm already hallucinating, same thing. And if I'm starving, if I'm extremely dehydrated, it's going to be very tough to perform in life. Right? Further, there are so many different interfering things that people oftentimes, unfortunately, engage in. For example, alcohol, that can make, again, high performance in life very improbable, to say the least. And so there's a certain base that is highly desirable and or necessary in order for anything to be built atop of it. Ideally, I feel physically decent. I'm not in at least great pain. Like many of us do struggle with some chronic pain, which is what it is, the joints, this and that, but at least nothing extremely acute. Right? Ideally, I have at least enough sleep. And ideally, my diet is not very deficient. Or ideally, it's not deficient at all, but some kind of standard. Ideally, I have enough to drink. And ideally, I'm not suffering from quote unquote brain fog. I'm not in a daze. I'm not dizzy. I'm not in altered, unfunctional quote unquote states of consciousness, something like that. Right? But that's just the base. That's just the start. I can have all of those conditions fulfilled perfectly in theory, in imagination. And yet, that still would not at all guarantee that I will be a happy human being. Why? Because human happiness is not predicated strictly on the physiology. We are not exactly equivalent to, at least in all ways, other animals. If you get a pig perfectly physically right, a pig will be just about as happy as it can be. Maybe it'll be a little bit happier with some piggy buddies to play with, but that's about it. Give it some slop, give it some water, all good. We're not like a pig. We have other greater needs. What we need to be happy is to be mature, is to be inwardly oriented, upward, at something higher than ourselves. What we need is to be moving in a direction away from selfishness, from self centeredness, from the endless dark pit and bog and basement of narcissism and that dark idolatry and worship of self. That's the kind of thing that we need. We need education. We need intellectual development. We need healthy personal relationships, such as are predicated on truthful ideas concerning other people and our relations with them. Meaning, if I think as a matter of truth that I am the only real person and everybody else exists just to serve me, that's not a good idea. That's not an idea on which healthy human relationships can be built, should we say. So, having established that physiological base, that's when we can get going. We can get going even before that, because innumerable great individuals throughout history have persevered through illness, even such as at times implicated our intellectual and conscious states themselves, and yet attained to inner goodness, and attained to maturity. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that a strong physiological base is extremely helpful and are necessary. That's when the action starts. Right? That's when the show begins. Not show. That's when the kind of quest begins to mature, to eradicate the lies that we tell ourselves, to remove or reduce our selfishness and self-centeredness, to serve other people, to correct our ideas about what is truly good, what is truly true and right. So with that said, to use again the analogy of the math test, in order to gain some insight as to the question of to what degree can psychiatric drugs be helpful to a given person, the question needs to be asked, is the suffering that I am experiencing in light of physiological conditions such as can in principle be modified by, let's say, ideally, by that which does work? Obviously, that's a whole separate question of what does and doesn't work. But let's say we're only dealing with that which does work. So, for instance, caffeine does work for very many people to modify whatever they would be called mental states, what have we. Let's assume we're only dealing with that which does work. So, is my lack of happiness in view of inadequate physiological conditions, such as could in principle be modified by something that does work, or not? And using the analogy of the math test, we see that something that no degree of physiological kind of well-being can help would be actually knowing the answers. If I don't know what 2 plus 2 is, I can drink all the caffeine in the world, and I can even use nootropics or what have we. Still is not going to give me the answer in and of its own self. So just so, in the broader sphere of life, I can use all sorts of substances and I can do whatever, and I can get myself feeling great. But that in itself will not make me less selfish. That in itself will not make me less self-centered. That in itself will not make me less vain and petty and narcissistic. And those are really the well springs of suffering. Erroneous ideas about oneself, about others, about one's relation to the whole, to other people, to reality, all that kind of stuff. So that can be kind of a way to try to gain insight as to the question. In theory, if I were to perfectly get everything right on that physiological level, what kind of person would I be? And there, perhaps, that which can modify those physiological conditions can have its place, because admittedly, it is very difficult to sometimes even find out who one is when constantly I'm in a daze, I'm in a fog, I'm extremely fatigued. It's not even a competitive question. I don't even know what I could be. So there, all due steps can be taken, assuming something works, which is an empirical question, right? But that should not be supposed to be the ultimate panacea, which would give us the knowledge, which would give us the goodwill, would give us the insight, such as is the sufficient, should we say, condition for human happiness. So we can consider it. Thank you for listening.